All right. Good day, folks. Thanks for coming and finding the warmth of our sun. I'm Matthew Brown, your host here at Madison 365. You can find us on Spotify, YouTube, Stitcher, and Apple Podcasts. Thanks for coming. So I'm going to be, over the next coming weeks, I think doing a bit of a focus, a bit more dig in on stuff around police reform, crime, and everything. I did a bit, but I don't think I did it justice. This stuff is complicated. Particularly, it did some stuff around the history of police and then violent crimes, and I want to zero in and focus a bit more. I think today what I'm going to do is talk a bit about the recent uptick in violent crimes, and I want to specify some violent crimes because there has not been an uptick in general like this, not just uptick, but it's been a spike in violent crimes, specifically gun crimes. But we haven't really seen the same type of uptick in other crimes. And still, as we think about criminalization, let's think about, I think wage theft is a great example of this when we think about laws and crime. So wage theft is when an employer underpays an employee by, let's say, like $100. So then an employee has to go to the district attorney, and it's this whole process, and maybe the employee gets something back, but most attorney generals and DAs don't go after employers for wage theft unless it's a large amount, meaning that worker is out of luck. It's much more of it's a high level. I don't know. It's civil, but it's criminal. It's one of those weird things on how we treat companies and corporations differently than when we treat individuals, particularly when corporations and companies commit a crime. They get a fine or they have to pay something. There's no real, what we see as the classical criminal aspect to it. No individual is particularly held accountable for it, and corporations aren't really held accountable for it. And even then, wage theft isn't brought in when it comes to really crime stats in the same way. But wage theft, the amount of money lost on wage theft each year, or particularly I think in the last couple of years, has outstripped that of burglaries and thefts. So, but who goes to jail are typically lower income folks who steal or burglarize more often than not because there's not a heck of a lot of options out there. So it's important to think about that and what we think about crime and crime rates. Most crime is really socially constructed in very real ways. So let's keep that in mind. But what we know about these rising violent crime rates is that for Western nations, it's really only seen in the United States outside of Sweden, which has rising gun rates, violent crime rates as well. But there's an interesting aspect. I believe it's Sweden, as far as gun ownership. Because Swedes have a lot of guns too, and most as well, particularly compared to the rest of the Europe. And it's a commonality with the United States. Let's keep that in mind. So what we're seeing right now, first in kind of the larger context, is rhetoric primarily from the right, but not exclusively around these rising violent rates and saying, blaming blue governors or, blue mayors and defunding the police and that kind of rhetoric as far as using it as an attempt to undermine modern day civil rights movement and saying, see, they got it wrong. We need our police. And of course, there's a lot of racial undertones to this. A lot of the rhetoric can be copy and pasted from what we saw in the crime waves, particularly the violent crime waves in the 80s and 90s. We also have to, think how the mainstream media launders these views and gives credences to it by not necessarily being critical in this. There's a couple of things we have to think about here. And there's good information that's coming out on this, and I'll get to that. But one, this is something that I'm going to be repeating later, is that cities haven't defunded the police. At best, there's been one at minimal, pennies to the dollar moved out of police budgets. And other times, New York City, they basically just did an accounting trick. Same with like Austin, Texas, when it came to their so-called defund efforts. So cities have been working with massively invested in police departments during this rise of gun violence. Defund isn't to blame, and there's data to back this up. Defund isn't to blame. The police have not been working in preventing and stopping gun violence. Police really have a minimal impact in actual crime prevention. You're looking at depending on the studies, 8, 10, 15% reduction in violent crime when you're talking about increased police presence. And keep in mind, investing in police is very, very expensive to do. When we have other options, such as the cure violence model or violence interruption, where we saw in West Chicago, West Garfield Park, the program reduced shootings by 67%. And this was really kind of looking at the public health model. Because what we know about gun violence is that one incident of gun violence can lead to 3, 4, 5, 6 other incidences of gun violence, and in fact, like branches out. It's like a virus. And in fact, there's a lot in common of violent crime and how it spreads to virology. And this is where the approach of looking at violent crime as a public health issue really came from. Was a virologist looked at this and said, wait, this looks like how viruses spread. So if we can attack this like we attack epidemics, viral epidemics, particularly when it comes to isolating and quarantining and kind of, finding these spread points and, the 1 or 2 people that, infect others. And that's what we need to think about. So these other programs, violence interruption programs, are far more effective and are invested on pennies to the dollar than police. And they work. So on the high end, just anecdotally, or just really looking at the picture, we know cities haven't defunded. They're working with full police budgets, and this violent crime raise has come under these fully ballooned police budgets, along with the fact that we know violence interruption techniques work better, they're cheaper, and that police don't really prevent this type of crime. Or at least at the same level, and are not cost effective at all. And there's something that's really missing in this when talked about guns is the spike in gun sales that we've seen over the last year. This nation has never been more armed with guns than it is now. There are more guns across this nation in every city, every municipality, than there's ever been within more people's arms. So we have this proliferation of armament across the nation. Of course, there's going to be a rise in gun violence. But it is a little bit more complicated than that. There's a great piece in the New Republic by Fordham University law professor John Pfaff, P-F-A-F-F. It is called... Scroll up, sorry, for y'all. Can criminal justice reform survive a wave of violent crime? An uptick in homicides across the country is getting blamed on reforms. That argument gets the data all wrong. It can become easy to make this conclusion. But really, if you make the conclusion, it becomes easy to make the conclusion that reformers are the reason to blame. But really what this means is when you're looking at it this way, one, it's not actually looking at the data. You're making you're confusing a correlation with a causation, and not even really fully understanding the effect of police or criminal justice reforms and how many of these things have actually even been implemented. And as somebody that has been involved in the reform space for quite some time, really minimal reforms have actually been implemented. There have been reforms, but it's been very, very slow and very, very hard progress to get even something, one little thing done, to even pilot out a mental health first response unit. We to detach that from police, something that the police can get upset about. We ask them to do too much, and they're not great at mental health. They do something wrong, and we criticize them for it. And say, why are you criticizing us? Well, we don't want you to do this. And it's a whole kind of rhetorical thing, and that's definitely something I want to revisit, this weird cycle, and particularly when it comes to solutions, and particularly when it comes to crime, because most things police respond to aren't even crimes. Getting distracted. I'm getting myself distracted on this. But let's bring this back and think about this. So in it, he goes on to say, to be clear, the defenders of the status quo are mistaken. Not only have reforms been less extreme than they often claim or perceive, they're not looking at this stuff objectively, even the kind of moderate or left folks. It's tinged with race and racism and their own perceptions of the world and their own cognitive dissonance. So then you see this rise of gun violence and these reforms they don't like. And they saw this rise of advocacy for these reforms and confuse the advocacy for reforms versus what's actually happening in cities and municipalities, and draw a false causation to the rise of gun violence. So what this rise in homicide has occurred more or less equally in places that adopted reforms and those that rejected them. So cities that adopted reforms and cities that rejected them, this rise it's been uniform across the country. Goes on to say, and given how few places have significantly altered their approach to crime, the homicide spike by and large took place on the status quo's watch. Those who want policy to remain more punitive are thus arguing for more of what has mostly failed us this past year. And they are trying to blame reforms that appear to be uncorrelated with the surge. Those who want policies to remain more, it's with the surge. Think about that. We've had this heavy investment in police. The reforms, if we have this massive investment, it's yet we blame the small percentage of reforms for this massive spike. Red lights go off for me when I see something like that. A small change and then a massive spike. It becomes easy to create a false causation and fail to actually dig in deeper because our confirmation biases kick in when that happens. He goes on to say even more. Any one city's share of homicide was roughly the same as its share in 2019, just appreciably higher. Unlike many previous periods, the spike was not the product of a few cities experiencing an especially bad year, such as 2016. Around 20% of the national increase in homicides was just due to Chicago. But almost every city suffering something close in unison, so this is a uniform thing. There is no evidence that cities with more progressive prosecutors experienced relatively worse outcomes than those with more conventional district attorneys. In fact, 2 of the 8 departments that reported declines in homicide, Baltimore, Maryland, and St. Louis County, Missouri, are home of the 2 counties' most high-profile, quote-unquote, progressive prosecutors. Interesting. It also found homicides had started to rise well before the cuts, or so-called cuts, in no small part because the budget in questions did not go into effect until October 2020. So almost none of the proposed cuts would have occurred until 2021 at the earliest, and most of the 2021 cuts involve simply shifting which agencies are responsible for certain tasks, such as mental health response. And goes on to explore some really interesting aspects of COVID, and I mean we forget this all took place in a pandemic with a lot of people losing their jobs. And those that are low income were really hit both by death and by job loss and economic loss. In one of my earliest episodes, there was a study that showed a direct correlation, very, very strong correlation and causation, very, very strong causation as well. See, got confused myself, but this strong connection, correlation, and causation with unemployment rates and violent crime rates. What happened this past year? A lot of people lost their jobs and the massive proliferation of guns. You could say a lot of people in Europe lost it, but they didn't. They handled it differently. Their policies weren't, during shutdown, let businesses go under, is they covered like 85% of the payroll, and they made it so that these shutdowns are economically possible for businesses to withstand these things, and in turn, people got paid. They handled it quite different than we did. Now, there are other issues going on why they did see the decline in COVID, mostly due to vaccine shenanigans, the politics stuff around vaccine and vaccine distribution and who gets it and so on and so forth. But guns have skyrocketed. And you're also seeing a delegitimization of not just police, but our governing apparatus in general. There's a real strong argument that the United States is a failed state or a failing state, at best. You're seeing people having less faith in the government and government operations. These are important things to recognize. So we can be a reactionary. We can act like this call to defund led to this rise in crime, or we can look at the data, move past our own cognitive dissonance in this and thinking, because we've been ingrained with propaganda around cops and the thin blue line and all these things, to think about crime in a very specific way when it's very different than what they lend us to believe, particularly around who commits it. And there's definite racial components to how we talk about and think about this rise in crime, particularly in gun deaths, and how it's pushed across. We know there's a lot of people out of work. We know there's a lot of guns on the streets. Very easily, accessible guns. You can go in and get a gun almost anywhere in this country without a waiting period, without a background check. So we have more guns than ever, with an emotionally distressed population, politically stratified population, a high unemployed population that has already seen a lot of death, and a government that is seen as less and less legitimate in a lot of ways, both due to polarization as well as we've seen this last year, really inability of the government at all levels to be effective in handling a crisis. Hundreds of thousands of more people died than needed to die. So there's this failing state aspect to all of this. So of course this is happening. It can be easy to blame activists and black radicals and the defund movement and abolitionists for all this, but the data just doesn't back it up. It doesn't. You can fall into easy tropes and look at easy correlations, but this rise happened before call to defund even was a popular thing, and we'll get into how another one on how defund isn't as unpopular as it seems. It's interesting. So we gotta sort through this, and it's a bit of a mess. But it's not defund. That we know, and we can infer a lot with the other things that we know. That is it for this week. I will be taking this next week off, but coming back around to continue kind of this deeper engagement on police reform, crime stats, and defund, and working through a bit more of these myths, these perceptions, and the data, and what it really tells us, particularly around how people actually want to be policed. It can be easy to look at surface levels of these studies and be deceived, but what actually is going on. So, enjoy your long weekend. Maybe I'll do something for next week, something quick around some thoughts around Frederick Douglass and his what is July 4th to a slave. It's a great little write-up. Yeah. Thanks for coming. Defining Warmth of Our Sun. I'm Matthew Brown, your host here at Madison 365. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and YouTube. Have yourselves a good week. Thanks. Bye.
This is 365 Media.